Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. This is systems thinking number 120, I believe. And so this in this series, it's what can systems thinkers learn from Watershed Stewardship. So yeah, thank you all for joining. In traditional systems thinking Ontario fashion, we'll go around the virtual room and just have folks introduce themselves. So you can unmute yourself. When I call out your name, you can say what brought you here today in the shortest form. So I'll just go based on the list that I have here in the participant window, and I'll call out some names. Anna Checkman.
Hello. Hello.
Oh.
Yes, I'm Anna. This is my daughter, Maria. I'm trying to multitask outside my daughter's skating lesson. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you
hear you.
Oh, okay. Yes. So, yes, I did my master's at York University, and I did some courses with Professor Martin Bunch in the Department of Environmental Studies and Urban Change. So he did some work with the watershed and the systemic changes in the environmental impact. Well, I'm not in the environmental studies, so I'm trying to find words that would work. But I read his papers, so that's about all I know on the topic. So I thought I'd join today and try to learn as much as possible, so I know more about it. And I look forward.
Oh, what watershed are you in?
Pardon?
Oh,
What
Natalija
is
was
the river
asking
that
for
is
people
closest to you? River or creek or lake?
Don River in North York.
Welcome.
It's a small river, but we have like 3 or 4 parks around this river in this area, so we usually hang out in those parks.
Okay.
Awesome. Welcome.
And we know Martin Bunch. He used to speak at Systems Thinking Ontario a few times.
Yeah.
Introduce me to the society. Okay, and somebody wants bread, so I'll probably mute it, but I'll join the rest of the conversation.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining up. Thank you for being here. Next up, Don Officer.
Oh, hi. Yeah, so I've been interested in systems for quite a while, and I'm still puzzled by some aspects of it. Mostly that it hasn't caught on more. But anyway, that's another matter. I'm actually pretty close to a watershed here. I'm about 400 yards from Lake Ontario, and I'm at the top of a hill. And there is a creek that runs about, I guess, about 5 blocks from here, right down to the water. And yeah, it's interesting because if I were any further nearer the water, I would be in danger of flooding. A lot of the people there don't have basements because it would be foolish. But it's interesting to consider the implications. And this is largely farmland around here, although there is some bush still. It's mostly new growth, though. And I'd be interested in knowing more about the whole issue.
Awesome. Thank you for joining, Don.
Okay.
Francesca, what brought you here today, and what river, what body of water are you near?
Hi, my name is Francisca. I'm in Toronto, so I guess the Lake Ontario watershed. The Garrison Creek is probably the closest creek that we have where we live. I'm an educational consultant for startups, and I've been trying to come to these on a regular basis. And personally kind of find watershed specifically interesting because I grew up in Switzerland, which is like home to many watersheds in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And and more recently, with all these rain showers that we've had, I've just found it really interesting to observe how our sub pump kept going all night long. So, and then also here, he's just eating dinner, and so not on camera right now, is my partner Sean Patrick, who is a program director at Greenpeace Canada, and I think he likes watersheds as well. Yeah.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you for having both those on camera and off camera. Next up on the thumbnail, Kelly.
Hey, I'm Kelly Okumura. Let's see. The question is watersheds. I'm in Muddy York. I'm downtown at St. Lawrence Market. The English kind of settled Toronto by filling in. So it's always really interesting to take a look at my building. I'm in walking distance to Sugar Beach, so it'd be Lake Ontario. My favorite watershed is certainly the Don, and I have had active interest in all of the hidden rivers that, as far as I know, there's one that is just right beside, that is buried underneath the New North St. Lawrence Market that is set to be open soon. So I hope the building doesn't tip, but there you go.
So, thank you. I hope the building doesn't tip as well.
Me too. I'm next to it.
Stephen Davies, good to see you. Would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, Stephen Davies is my name. By profession, I'm a management consultant, but also a systems thinker and design thinker as well, and bring both of those disciplines to my consulting. My first interest in watersheds happened. I'm in the Don watershed, the Lower Don Valley. And I'm a lead steward with Toronto Nature Stewards in the Don Valley. But I live in Riverdale, and there are many hidden rivers underneath the properties that have been built in Riverdale. And so my sump pump has been going nonstop for the last few days as well. My first interest in watersheds began back in 2004 when I was part of a provincial government initiative to build a water management architecture that took a cross-ministerial or an interministerial view at all of the programs that touched on water across all of the different ministries. So we did groundwater, we did surface water, we did water quality, we did water quantity, and we ended up inventorying, I think it was almost 27 distinct water programs across something like 17 different ministries. And it was just an extraordinary survey. It's very clear to me that the management of water on a watershed basis faces a serious uphill battle. And so I'm here to hear of the latest battles that have been happening.
Thank you for joining. Yeah, and I think Natalija and Susan will have quite a bit to say about that. Lee Abba, what brought you here today?
Hi, sorry. Yes, my Zoom registration was definitely a mistype. My name is Liana Irvin.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I was 2 minutes late, and so my fingers did not adequately express my name. I am a theater professional, and my current ponderings are using biomimicry strategies in terms of sustainability of theatrical production. And I currently live in Philadelphia, so we are on the Schuylkill and Delaware. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and so my local river there is the Lehigh River. And what got me interested in the water is I took a paddling excursion when I was maybe 12 or so, and just the power of water and noticing how embedded water is in our life was really impactful, and thinking about how that can apply to emergent strategies for arts and culture is kind of where I'm at right now.
Excellent. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Elena.
My name's Elena Leonard. I grew up along the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania. I'm currently visiting in Philadelphia along the Schuylkill, and my home is watershed is probably Garrison Creek. I'm currently very interested in water from several different perspectives, including being the chair at this point of the Ecologos environmental organization that puts on the Water Documentary Film Festival. And that organization is interested in protecting water and taking action and informing people primarily through film.
Very interesting. Thank you for joining, Lena. Stephen Siwit.
Hello, hi. I'm Stephen, I'm here in Toronto. My interest in watersheds, well, originally it started to come out of doing some socio-drama work in South Africa. That was more about social topographies and the social landscape, but then adapted that and we were doing that with Oxfam Australia for water catchment areas, for looking at different ways that people work with and deal with water issues in an area where it has severe drought, and how they deal with sanitation and other issues. So this sort of work with different types of communities, it raised this whole question, which ended up butting up against systems thinking and psychology in a pretty drastic way, and sort of revealed that they're completely different approaches. They're very much like 10,000 feet approaches coming down, as opposed to being within and among. So really interested in how to think about watersheds from within, from a participatory agent-based perspective, as much as from a systemic, external, observed perspective.
Gotcha. Thanks, Steve. Salman.
Yeah, hi. So the watershed, Bronte Creek, Lake Ontario, and I drop in on these sessions and learn a lot. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Now I'll call upon the previous co-organizers here. So third last, Peter Jones.
Hi, I'm in Toronto this week, where we're in the Don River watershed and 3 floors up, so not in danger of flooding. But when back in Mexico City, they're 4 months into a drought with one evening of rain since January that I know of. So it's so I appreciate the water that we've had here and the green that it's brought. My introduction to the conservation of water may have been in doing a kind of personal survey of the town creek of Ashland, Ohio. I was in 5th grade, and then writing a letter to the editor about the pollution that I found, which got printed because Earth Day had some impact, and it started moving in the right direction. So I had an early sense of civic impact around an issue that's been with me for a long time. So it's an important natural system for us to participate in.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for being here. Good to see you back, Peter.
Mm-hmm.
David Ng.
So I live south of Stephen Davies, so I'm along the Don River, between Queen Street and Eastern Avenue. In the 1800s, Eastern Avenue was a marsh. And so interesting thing in the long-term history is that my street, Booth Avenue, is going to become a thoroughfare across the lakeshore into Portlands. And so I bike down to the Portlands quite often, and I'm watching all the developments down there. And I'm glad for it because it's going to prevent flooding in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. And my name is Zad Khan. I'm hosting today's session. I'm a graduate of the SFI program, and that's how I came through to Systems Thinking Ontario through Professor Peter Jones. I actually genuinely don't have that much knowledge in the space of watershed stewardship. So I'm going to be not just playing the role of getting to learn more about it, but genuinely learning more through Natalija and Susan, who I'll introduce in a moment. But yeah, I'm also in the Toronto Center, so most likely the Don River is the closest watershed. But so in this session, typically we have these sessions where we're bringing in topics or folks who have expertise in other domains, that may or may not be directly connected to systems thinking, and we ask them what can we learn from their fields, from their work, from the work that they do. And so to start us off, Natalija and Susan, rather than do the reading the bio intro, I'm gonna maybe ask the question in which you can embed your introduction in it, which is how did you come to the field of watershed management and stewardship, and what is your relationship to water? So we can start from there, and then we can kind of go with the flow. Bad pun. But yeah, Susan, why don't you start us off, and then I'll go to Natalija.
Great, thanks, guys. It's such a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. I just want to say thanks so much for joining, and I'm super grateful to be here. So what brought me to watershed planning? I love your story, Peter. I love your name too, Peter Jones in Toronto. That has a deep connection. And I'm speaking of Sacred Feathers, Peter Jones, who is the Anishinaabe leader of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who's the treaty holder for the city of Toronto. So I've always had a great interest in the environment and social justice. I still remember as a kid swimming in the Rouge River with a friend of mine, which went through her property in Stouffville, where I'm born and raised. So I've lived in Anishinaabe territory my whole life, but you know what? I'm gonna hang my hat on geography. I think I can safely blame an interest in geography for my love of watersheds. And then starting my career at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, where I was for 10 years, just expanded my knowledge so much about watershed stewardship. But I would say it all started with geography. Over to you, Natalija.
My own career in water governance has been more of a watershed approach of droplets kind of trickling from here and there into an overall environmental peace building theme. Born more in the Drina and the Danube watershed, I grew up in Canada, so the Humber River watershed has been home. And I remember that powerful feeling of being able to drink water directly from a spring and a stream, and yet also seeing the pollution that exists in the lakes and the way that sewage actually ends up flowing into the creeks after a storm. But the thing that really drove me to go into water was when people were talking about water wars in undergrad. And so coming from a conflict-affected place, I really thought it was disturbing that the substance that gives us life could be a source of conflict, and wanted to get into designing and supporting institutions that promote more inclusive water governance.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you both. I think there's a lot of personal connections to water, like many of us on the call. So that's very fascinating. I wonder if you can tell us both a little bit more about the field of water governance and water management. And perhaps you can share, like, what are some of the objectives of that field? What does it aim to do? What is it trying to accomplish? And that can vary in your respective roles as well. So either of you can start us off.
That's a very, very big question. I mean, water touches upon so many aspects of our lives, and it's at various nexus points. There's water energy nexus, water energy food nexus. So there's many different stakeholders who might not immediately be within the conservation authorities or within government and those types of management roles, but who nevertheless, by virtue of how they steward the patch of land that they're on, are also directly tied to watershed management and the implementation of watershed plans.
Well, I guess my answer might be a little technical, so forgive me, because I've been working in the field of watershed management in Ontario for a little while. And I guess, I start with conservation authorities, but I'm on a board at the MPAC, Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. And this morning, we had a presentation on environmental planning. And it started at a very high level on, the provincial policy statement, how natural systems are defined. And it worked its way down from policy at the provincial level to official plans and how it's interpreted from words in a document to maps and then to subdivision design on the land. And it was a really good example because it showed effectively watershed management practice in reality on the landscape. And it's actually pretty hard to see that in Ontario. There's a bunch of reasons for that. But to see the translation of what we know about what we need to protect on the landscape to built form that reflects it was a powerful demonstration of what is watershed management in the province of Ontario. And I guess, for me, I think about traditional rights of First Nations, Aboriginal rights, constitutionally protected rights, and how little engagement they have as the traditional guardians in what is colonial watershed planning practice, which is an issue. But then I also think about outside of watershed plans, like you mentioned, Natalija, which were created in law in Ontario for the first time through the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Act and Plan, which was passed in 2001. And that plan mandated, I think it was 2001, that plan mandated watershed plans for the very first time to be incorporated into official plans. So that had never happened before. But another area of really important, great importance as it relates to watershed management is source water protection in Ontario as well, which doesn't get enough attention. It's found its way into all of our community official plans, but how well is it upheld? I don't know if I see that on the ground. And I think there's just so much work that needs to happen right now to improve this science perspective. It really, because it comes from a lot of the sciences. And that can include traditional knowledge, which is like a non-Western science. There's so much work to do to create, to bring that nexus together, as you described, Natalija, so beautifully. But we're really moving in the opposite direction right now. And I can get into detail, but maybe that's for another question.
I was about to say, Susan, let's just jump right into it. Let's just keep going with that. Honestly, like Natalija and Susan both, it sounds like there's a description that water and management it's a nexus that touches a lot of different aspects of life. And so that means there's a lot of different fields that you're also going to be working with. And that means it's going to bring up a whole slate of challenges. So maybe you can just share with us from your vantage points of the work that you're doing, what are the diverse fields that you're working with that are included? And what are the ones that are not included? And what are some of the challenges that you're working on?
Do you want to go, Natalija?
Well, I'll preface it by saying that what the little bits of the water sector that I touch is only a fragment. So we're going to be having the Great Lakes Sustainable Growth Forum taking place in Toronto in June, and that's going to touch all aspects that the Toronto Board of Trade is involved with. Water touches shipping, it touches agriculture. And I'm not always engaged with those fields, but when I was working for Environmental Defence Canada, and we were working on nutrient pollution, it was my role to work with farmers, and they have a very different perspective on how the land is managed and their idea of how engaged government should be in terms of whether subsidies are provided or if regulations are being the incentives that are used to introduce best management practices or limit the amount of nutrients that are entering lakes like Lake Erie. Then when it comes to plastic pollution, it's something that we talk about, but then there's this other actor that is so far removed from water, and yet microplastics are ending up in our waterways. And so how do you pull them back into that conversation as well, and bringing that consumer response, like the CSR and the design of the packaging itself? Currently, my work is twofold. One, with the hat of Director of Business Development at RainGrid, I am building out a disruptive form of stormwater management, basically decentralizing it by capturing the rain in the residential areas as well as with an ICI. So climate adaptation that is essentially taking cisterns, automating them at a distributed scale, creating a network where that data can then also generate payment for ecosystem services, stormwater credit offsets, also be used as a way of digitizing public asset management and informing how we continue to build more resilience into communities, especially those that are most heavily impacted by climate change. And then with another hat, through our Future First, the intention there was really to connect people to each other and to nature through dialogue, using the watershed or other ecological regions as a metaphor for building peace.
That's
Wow.
brilliant. I love that. That's so cool. And Natalija, you really come with a different type of experience than I do. So, you know, it seems really on the ground and in some ways very innovative. I feel like I'm stuck in kind of a policy regulatory role, you know, in a lot of the work that I do that's not with education and awareness around treaties and Aboriginal rights. So as a watershed planner, the people that I work with are primarily other planners, lawyers, hydrogeologists, botanists, geotechnical engineers, fluviogeomorphologists, politicians, community activists. And I think that covers most of it. And so this is, to me, really the brilliance of watershed management, and what I felt really showed me how it is a vehicle for change for the future that we all kind of hope for. Some people call it integrated watershed management. I know that the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority, I met with them this week, and they're moving into a One Health model, which is beyond integrated watershed management, which is what Natalija is talking about. So capturing storm rain runoff in the city, that's integrated watershed management. So it's an actual applied example of what it looks like. And so I guess for me, I realized watershed management brings all those voices into the room, and they all come with different knowledge. You know, for example, the engineer, the stormwater engineer, will be telling me the grades that the subdivision needs to be designed at. But the biologist will be telling me, you can't grade in this area though, because there's flora that are species at risk. And then, you know, the politician will be telling me, well, we need to get this many units in this subdivision in order to keep this particular developer happy. And then, you know, the hydrogeologist will be telling me, you know, you can't go too deep here because you can puncture an aquifer. And so it's just, you know, all this information comes together in watershed management. And you know, you're working even with different municipalities, because the watershed, and I live in the Credit River watershed. I was born and raised at the divide between the Duffins and the Rouge, but I am like several meters from a branch of the West Credit. I thought I would answer that while I had the chance. So, you know, there is no greater nexus in my mind of systems thinking than watershed management planning, because you have to find a path forward based on what everyone is telling you. And it has to align with policy and law, which today is regressive, extremely regressive. And we can thank the More Homes Built Faster Act for that. We can also thank the new bill, Bill 185, cutting red tape. This is the theme of to get more homes built faster, is literally the name of that law that's been tabled last week. So we're seeing a lot of regressive changes to watershed planning. And, you know, really we should be oiling the wheels in the direction of advancing watershed planning, because it's efficient. It gets everybody that needs to be there in the room. It looks from the ground up instead of, you know, the dollar sign down. And it's actually, in Ontario, we were quite good at it for a few decades, but we've really, you know, we had so much room for improvement, even though we were really leaders compared to many provinces. And unfortunately, that's, with the loss of natural heritage being a commenting power under the Conservation Authorities Act, natural heritage is wetlands, it's rivers, it's forests, it's all of that. So it's misleading. It's a misleading term, but it's really everything that we all love within the natural system. Conservation authorities now can no longer comment on that. So that's actually quite a lot of outside of their regulated area. And that accounts for a lot of natural heritage is not within the regulated area. So if you can think of first order water courses, often second order water courses are not within the regulated area. Smaller wetlands are not within the regulated area. Upland woodlands are not within the regulated area, because regulated areas are areas of natural hazard from flow, from fluvial dynamics, right? So areas where life or property are at risk is regulated, and everything else now is kind of open season in Ontario as a result of Bill 23, the More Homes Built Faster Act. So yeah, maybe I'll pause right there.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I think there's a lot there. Not only is the field so rich, but you're also working with so many other perspectives. Like you said, mentioned engineers to biologists. And then on top of that, you have the policy layers that are just stacked seemingly against a lot of the interest of conservation. So maybe just take a pause here and invite the audience or those on the call here. Is there anyone that has any reflections, questions, comments, discussion points that you want to bring up at this point? Open floor, or you can use the reaction button and raise the hand as well if you like. Okay, David.
As we're having this discussion, I make the distinction between governance and management. And governance is more about setting the boundaries, and management is more about actually trying to go a specific direction. It sounds to me like you're talking a lot more about governance and who can do what as opposed to active programs. Is that the case, or am I hearing wrong?
Are you speaking to me, David?
Yeah.
I guess I am speaking about governance, but I see it as land use change. So I'm really speaking about land use change, any kind of development or alteration on the landscape. And so I think I'm mostly talking about growth politics and how it intersects with watershed management planning. Does that help? Maybe I'm totally off topic here.
No, it's good. Natalija?
Yeah, I'd say where Susan and I very much overlap is in prefacing the importance of having inclusive water governance and the role of both Indigenous and local engagement.
Right.
So that's where it really does step into that territory of governance and democratizing how we manage water. Whereas traditionally, the way water is managed, it's seen as very, control, conveyance. It's the municipalities that are responsible for providing us with clean water and treating what we're sending out of our homes, as well as what's flowing off of our properties into the sewer system. So it's a very controlled approach. And what we're trying to say is perhaps let's not just look at the epistemology of how you share the knowledge of how to manage water correctly, but to really broaden the playing field by looking from that systems perspective of where does water touch down, and are we making the most rational decision? For instance, why do we call it stormwater? Why is there stormwater management? Why is that water that hits our property treated as a waste that picks up pollution, flows into the creeks, overwhelms our systems, leads to combined sewer overflows, and also flooding? Why are we not seeing the value in that and designing differently for it? And by engaging in those conversations with a broader swath of the public and people who are not usually the actors that would be involved in directing in a particular direction or setting that vision, having them involved in that shared vision setting and the articulation of what are the needs in their communities, what kind of floods are they seeing, what's happening to their basement. We're hearing folks here that are very much aware of where they have the floods and where there's droughts. And by including more of those folks, then you can also build more of that political will to make sure that the correct type of planning and the correct type of development goes forward. And also that they maybe don't apply as much road salts or are more aware when the local tree canopy is going down as well.
Stephen Davies, I would have perfectly guessed that this is your cue-in.
Well, no, I thank you. And I mean, Natalija, I really love the picture that you're painting around an inclusive approach to water management. But the history of water management is one that where politics is always intervening. And, you know, if we just focus on what you shared around stormwater, you know, the entire foundation of the conservation authorities here in Ontario was as a result of Hurricane Hazel and the extreme flooding that resulted from that storm. And so you look at what's going on in Toronto at the moment. I mean, billions of dollars are being invested in channelizing stormwater so that they don't run into the same pipes as the sewers. And so we've got massive infrastructure investment programs going on largely because they're anticipating that storm events will get worse as a result of climate change. And we're already in the position where economically insurers are refusing to insure homeowners with property insurance for flooding because of where they sit in a floodplain. So, I mean, the intersectionality in water management is so multidimensional as to make it super vulnerable to political interference at any number of different levels. And I mean, really, it makes me want to weep the amount of interference that goes on. I mean, you look at the core challenge we're facing is urban sprawl, right? And getting water into new developments. Well, hey, guess what? The big construction companies in Woodbridge are laying concrete pipe, and they're bringing water from outside of the watershed in order to fuel single-family homes in the sprawl. It's just insane what's going on in this province.
It's so true. I'm
But
so with you,
really,
Stephen.
the
It's so
ruling
insane.
power structure of the conservatives and the guys that keep them in power, being largely the development industry, has got a lockdown on watershed management right now. They're doing everything they can to emaciate the system. Sorry, I feel really passionate about this because we are getting like literally we are not being able to practice integrated watershed management as you're describing it, Natalija, and we need to.
Yeah, I think Susan and I and you, Stephen, are very much aligned, and I think folks here would feel the same, that the natural way of managing the natural boundaries of the watershed should be how we're administrating, should be how we're planning for development. And part of it is also with stormwater, that's the impervious surfaces. So right now, the city of Toronto was looking at, can we introduce a levy? But of course, with the cost of living crisis, folks are a little bit more stern about wanting to spend a little bit extra. But if we were to also educate the public through dynamic ways where either new technologies or old social infrastructure of actually gathering people within their sub-watershed to understand how what happens on their property actually ends up having a collective impact, there's this natural form of subsidiarity and the system seeing itself that working at the watershed scale allows.
And I'm with you totally on that. I mean, as I've recently adopted a theory of change that, you know, regeneration is going to happen bioregionally, and bioregionally means by adopting, you know, natural water boundaries. And I've started to network across the city and into Caledon and up north into the other outlying areas. And there are literally hundreds of grassroots organizations that are doing the kinds of things that you're describing. It's just that at the moment, the empowerment from the bottom up has not yet reached a level where it can challenge the top-down governance model. It's being literally forced upon us.
Let me ask Natalija and Susan, are you working with polycentric governance approaches that can engage people beyond you know, just the kind of regulatory and decision makers in Susan's case, or in Natalija with you know, and you're working with Rain Grid right now too, so you're probably working with completely different group of people that over the years, you know, you've worked with everything from, farmers and landowners to NGOs. So, I mean, these are organizations that already have some interests. And so there's some, I guess you could say, polycentricity there. But who is missing that ought to be involved in a more, if there were a clarified approach to, a multilateral governance that could help educate and hear from people, maybe could even work with the public in a more, in a better way, especially with, these measures that are being proposed, that, those measures come before education. People get the shock that, oh, there's a rain tax, and then, now you have to educate people, but you're a little behind the news on that. Or maybe I'm behind the news because I've been in Mexico City, but I've been trying to catch up with what's going on here. And so it seems like the conversation you're bringing to us is perfectly timed to kind of raise what's going on at the edge of these possible changes.
I feel like
Well,
Susan has a lot to say there first, and then I'll jump in.
Polycentric governance models. Well, who's missing? So I feel like I already work in kind of a polycentric space because my clients are primarily not-for-profit organizations that are advocates for watershed management or, advocates for conservation that are up against developers, really most often, that are proposing things that are totally inappropriate for, the area. And so who's missing? Like the 1% is missing, the developers, the landowners. They're missing. They don't want to be a part of, often, from my experience, public discourse as it relates to what they see as their land. They don't want to be a part of that. And a lot of the time, it's about the cash cow that is Ontario urban sprawl and coming up against a system that really, for all intents and purposes, the planning process in Ontario, if we look at watershed management and we look at growth, which again is sort of my area, we're looking at a system in recent years that has been largely redesigned to facilitate sprawl. And so, it's back to the future. Like we've literally gone back like 25 years in planning thought in Ontario in the past like 3 or 4 years. So the new bill that was launched last week, Bill 185, takes away third-party appeal rights to official plans and to zoning bylaw amendments. So that means First Nations and all of the public, according to Bill 185, will have no right of appeal for official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments, which is totally unconstitutional. And why does that matter to watershed management? Because they might propose a dump adjacent to, the Credit River, or they might propose in the official plan, right? It kind of lays out the direction of the community's intentions as it relates to how the land will be used. And when I speak about the land, I'm speaking about the land and the river together as one. And I think that we're incredibly lucky living in the Great Lakes region because we have Lake Ontario, we have Lake Erie. We can say, if we look at like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and the annexes within the agreement, the 10 or 11 that there are, we can say, take a look at how bad this annex is doing. Like Lake Ontario is not doing well. We're losing top species in the food chain, and fish are dying because they're literally starving because we have too many nutrients in the lake. And why? Because Lake Erie is getting crazy polluted. Like Lake Erie has been rated as poor. The quality of Lake Erie is poor. And why? Because there's so much fertilizer coming into the lake from all the farms around it. And that connects to Lake Ontario before Lake Ontario goes out to the sea through the St. Lawrence, right? And so we're seeing changes. And the reason why I say we can benefit from the Great Lakes is, well, I mean, it's obvious, but at the same time, we have this end of pipe example right before us. We have the Great Lakes health right before us. So we can look at watershed management, or the lack thereof, and say it is showing itself at its endpoint, at its destination, because it's not like we're in New Brunswick on the St. John's where the endpoint is the sea. I mean, no one's going to be able to analyze the Atlantic as effectively as we can Lake Erie. So we can really use that as a leveraging point, because we can assess the conditions of the end of the river so much better than other locations. And that's kind of what organizations like Environment and Climate Change Canada, I guess, are trying to do. But I think about your point, Natalija, about command and control, really about water, and that's sort of the zeitgeist that we have in Ontario. And I think about the International Joint Commission and how they're really doing excellent work. But a lot of the Water Boundaries Treaty kind of speaks to, historically they were doing a lot of dam building, damming construction, flow, controlling the flow, and they're really trying to grow their mandate into meaningful relationships with First Nations, into all these other things. But they're kind of up against, these other narratives that are still stuck in a command and control framework. So I'll turn it over to you, Natalija.
And sorry, Anna, did you want to immediately respond to something, or can I?
Yes, go ahead. I have a question in regards to what Susan was saying, but it can wait. It's not an urgent question.
Thanks. Yeah, so speaking of Lake Erie, I mean, I think most folks here know that it's one of the shallowest lakes, but I don't know if folks know that it was also in Dr. Seuss's Lorax, because it was actually so polluted, and it was detergents that were the main culprit back in the day, and community organized, and they reversed it, and we were able to see that change, as Susan's pointing out. So there's various stakeholders that can play a role, but the cheapest way to preserve our drinking water and to keep fresh water intact is to avoid that pollution in the first place. And the way that you do that is by having those regulations and the solid planning. That's part of what's impacting our Indigenous communities. But if they don't have a seat at the table, unfortunately, like Susan was saying with the IJC, we had the first Indigenous commissioner, Henry Lickers, who's actually from a straddling community that's both within Canada and the US. New perspectives can come to the table. And so he was both a Western scientist and an Indigenously trained scientist. And so both of our work has very much touched on like how to braid between Indigenous and non-Indigenous worldviews. And that's going into a different ontology, and that's moving away from just seeing water as this inert resource that contributes to our economy that we exploit, but to something that inherently has value, not just for us as a human, but also for all the fish that are within the water, all the plants that are along the water's edge, all of the ducks, like all of the life that relies upon that system, and humbly seeing ourselves as just one part of that system. And then to the, I guess, question that Peter had asked before about polycentric governance, I mean, there's a lot of self-organizing groups around it, but they have these different worldviews that shape how they engage with water, whether those be boards of trade or shipping or the OFA, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. So it's how do we bring together all of these under one big umbrella? And in Canada, we're trying with a Canadian, the new Canadian Water Agency. And what will that look like? What will that coordination look like nationwide?
Mhm.
Do you want to ask the question, Anna?
Yes, I found it interesting that Susan said that the 1% are not represented in all this complex discussion, even though they are the landowners, and oftentimes they have a lot of decision-making power, and also the urban sprawl and development. So it does seem that like there's 1% that is not participating that could actually make a big difference in protecting the water. And I just wanted to ask Susan, from her experience, why that is, because obviously if they're making a lot of money from the land and the water and everything, why they are not involved in the discussion? Is it because their interests, the interests of the 1% are like overrepresented, that they feel so secure in their positions that, all this discussion that's happening below their level is pretty much irrelevant because they make the final decisions? Or is it because their interests are, like so kind of extraneous to everything that water management is dealing with, that there's no point for them to participate? They're just trying their best to like hold on and preserve the status quo. So yeah, I just wanted to find out why there's a portion of the system, a significant portion of the system, that's not participating in moving forward and preserving the system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I throw that moniker out there of the 1% because I'm talking about the multi-millionaire, billionaire Ontarians that, own a huge chunk of land. And why do they not participate? Because it's not part of their business model. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not on their radar. Like there's a business model out there, which some people have done extremely well at, like the DeGasperis of the world that own things like Condrain, that are building those concrete pipes, that are conveying water. It's just, I just don't think it's in their business model. And the community is a barrier to getting what they want. And what they want is maximum profit. And I don't think that it really is about accountability to land and relationship to land at all. And, I did my graduate thesis at York University, actually, on gender in governance. And I still remember Gary Lynn O'Connor, who was the longtime mayor for the township of Uxbridge. And she was mayor for 35 years or something, born and raised in Uxbridge. And Uxbridge at the time was doing so well. Like they had given themselves the name of the Trails Capital of Canada. They had developed really beautiful subdivisions that were sensitively designed. They were leading the charge on environmental planning and growth. And why? Because Gary Lynn leaned into her development community in Uxbridge. And I remember her telling me this: I know all my developers. I know them really well. And I asked things of them. And she took me on a tour of Uxbridge. Well, I'm from Stouffville, so I kind of knew Uxbridge. But she took me on a tour of Uxbridge and showed me all the amenities. They had a curling club. They had this. They had so much more than my hometown. So much more. And they were smaller than me. And it was because she had this network of trust with these people, and she knew them all. She knew them all. And so she could push the envelope with them in a way. And that comes back to, politics is at the heart of this. And I just think that there is really a system, especially today, when we think of like some of the strongest laws we have as it relates to watersheds, are completely undermined. Like we have pay to slay under the Species at Risk Act. And, there's this decategorization or delisting potential of provincially significant wetlands now, where you can break them apart now and build in certain areas of them that wouldn't have been considered before. So it's a dismantling, and that dismantling is intentional and systemic. And we, if I could encapsulate this really well for you, Anna, it's ministerial zoning orders. Like, let's take a great example. This ministerial zoning orders were this unique exception under the Planning Act for emergencies. Like Lake Simcoe Protection Plan was passed under a ministerial zoning order because the Lake Simcoe was declared dead. And so they passed it under an MZO, and that was a good example. When that mall collapsed in Kirkland, Ontario, or wherever that was, they passed a ministerial zoning order because there was not the sufficient municipal infrastructure, like in terms of governance, to address that engineering failure. But ministerial zoning orders have been converted into a tool of power to grant approvals without following process. And so you literally just have to walk into the minister's office if you can get in. And if you have the right people in the room, you do. And they literally, I have seen ministerial zoning orders that are literally tailored to the subdivision. They are so specific. They have like setbacks and everything. So it's really incredible. And I think it just shows you the regime that we are living under right now is one that is completely centered to profiting.
Corruption. Can I say corruption?
Yeah. And
It's
so,
just like, you know,
yeah,
you're describing it and it sounds like corruption.
because it is. And so, you know,
It's
we're
the values crisis.
yeah, it's all about, and you know, it's all about building homes now. And yes, we understand that maybe there is a housing shortage, but all of that work had been done in the growth plan 10 years ago. Like we had figured out everything that needed to happen in the growth plan, which again has been effectively removed. So maybe I'll just pause right there.
I'll say yes, it is corruption, but it's also part of what we're seeing in terms of governance at every single stage globally right now. There's this meta crisis that's going on in terms of what values are actually shaping decision making, and how is the public actually able to connect with each other, and how do we build more of that groundswell to actually articulate what is good governance and how do we bring that back. In the Haudenosaunee frame of engaging with a meeting and beginning, there's the word of thanks. And that idea of having gratitude. Imagine if we had more gratitude for the mature ecosystems. So instead of Metrolinx going through and cutting down a bunch of trees that are beyond 30 centimeters of diameter in a riparian area, where they're so important to keep the soil in place, to also deal with the urban heat island effect, to house endangered species and bats. Instead of us just going, oh, okay, that could easily be replaced because we have this mechanistic understanding of you plant a tree. Well, maybe no, because 50% of those trees have been shown to die if they're not watered and maintained. So how do we rebuild that connection between people and nature to understand the value that's already there? And within RainGrid, we're trying to work with developers because by engaging the residential scale, where rain falls, and not treating the public as something that's scary or too cumbersome to work with, seeing the public as assets. What if we gamify the way that people manage water on site so they can see, oh my gosh, look, by capturing the rain, I reduced floods by this much, greenhouse gas reduction by this much, because there's less water that's being conveyed and then treated. With the stormwater credits, like there's a direct like pocketbook effect, but it's also a tool for being able to communicate with people and share information and build that literacy around how what happens on their property connects to the broader whole. And doing more of that and less of not trusting the public or keeping certain decisions within one's space is what we need. And that's my biggest bias in terms of why I think we need inclusive watershed governance. And globally, as we start to have more of these conversations around what's happening with the climate, with how water is displaced, where it's too much or too little, and some countries are already seeing one year they have a drought and the next year they have excessive floods. Water is also becoming a bit more securitized. And that's dangerous because when people start to panic, they might hoard the water, but water naturally wants to flow. Water is a connector, it moves between us. And when we artificially hoard that water and securitize that water, we're doing something that's very antithetical to life. And the more people we include in conversations, and the more perspectives we include in conversations, women and youth, that's one thing that I worked towards with the Water Youth Network, the more that we can then broaden and think strategically and bring it back to thinking about the basin. And between those countries where they might be securitizing water, thinking about, what kind of benefits can be exchanged from the upstream to the downstream countries? Where does it make sense to do the hydropower? Where does it make sense to do the agriculture? What kind of trade agreements can be built in? But that takes imagination, creative thinking, and welcoming participation and not seeing participation as a threat.
It also takes it takes a lack of a fear of governance. I think the thing is, like this is calling upon our challenges of what is governance and what is its effectiveness. And like to have meaningful watershed management in the way that you've described it, you need to have investment. You know, we need to have investment in what happens on the land. And, you know, that to me was always the conservation authorities. That was my reference, because that's where I worked for a decade, right? Like, we were the people on the land. We were organizing watershed alliances of communities, politicians, representatives, advocates. We were bringing them all together. We were talking to them several times a year over dinner. You know, here's what we're doing. Here's what the changes are. They were bringing forward their concerns, and we were working to try to help to address them. That was my job for years on the Humber River at the TRCA. That's, you know, and watershed alliances are gone. A lot of them have closed up and shut down, you know. People stopped showing up. I'm not sure if it was like the reverse effect of technology, where everybody's just too busy on their phones, like we're too distracted, and people weren't coming anymore. I know that was a part of it. Another part of it was budgets. They didn't want to pay. They didn't want to pay to feed people to come and talk about things. But I feel like if ever there was a need for a tool like that, like it's now. We really need this organized approach to watershed, community watershed engagement, where people come together and they care. And I know every single time I talk to someone, I know that they do. I know that they care. And they want to be involved, and they want to try to do something. But I think this part of the challenge is we're just inundated with bad news a lot of the time. There's so much happening in the world right now, and I think people they have like an information saturation, where they, you know, and so maybe maybe this is part of the cure, is like actually getting people out of their house and into their neighborhood. It's calling together like old-fashioned kitchen table chats, because really that's the beginning. That's what this is in a virtual form, in my opinion. And that's really where it all happens. That's where all the good change takes place. And, you know, this is a vehicle for that. And so, you know, I want to thank you, David and Zaid, for coordinating this, and Peter, and for all of you for coming, because, you know, I feel the pressure. I feel like Ontario is at a turning point. Never in my career would I ever have thought we would go so far in reverse. I never would have ever imagined this. You know, because it's just, I started my career out when watershed plans were being formed, and when we were seeing, you know, in the early 2000s, how much trouble we were in, how stormwater managements were probably not very effective, stormwater management ponds, and how they were funneling huge amounts of pollutants that were finding their way into our drinking water system, how, you know, stormwater runoff was a big concern, and it was causing huge amounts of like erosion, and like so many rivers were beyond their carrying capacity in regional storms. And I wanted to just make one point of correction on Hurricane Hazel, and conservation authorities being formed. Conservation authorities are actually about 20 years older than Hurricane Hazel. The first one was formed as the Grand River Commission in the 1930s. And it was over concerns over sediment and flooding on the Grand. And it accumulated as a result of massive deforestation in Ontario. And it was the planting program of the Scots pine, which you probably see in different areas. There'll be whole forests of Scots pine, which happened in like the 30s and 40s across Ontario, because there was so much deforestation, and everybody was freaking out because the waters were filling with sediment. And so it took Hurricane Hazel for conservation authorities to develop regulatory power. But they were around before Hurricane Hazel. And now we have 36 in the province, 5 in the north and 31 around Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. But I think I've diverged a little bit there.
No problem. That's on brand for Systems Thinking Ontario. So it's all good, and we're happy to host you and have these discussions. I maybe do have a follow-up question, but to the audience, don't consider me back to, if anyone else has another question, feel free to raise your hand or start typing it in, but I wanted to go back to a point for both of you, Natalija and Susan, about working with different worldviews. So there's in systems thinking, this tends to happen from when you take a systems perspective, you're able to observe that many people who are stakeholders that you're interacting with may give primacy to their concern without focusing on other concerns. So you might have isolated or narrow views. And I wonder if you can bring us a little bit, maybe more intimately, into some of those conversations you may have, where Susan, do you ever find yourself having to negotiate between competing interests? And maybe you can offer some insight and experience as to how, from a systems thinking perspective, what would be interesting for us is how do you go about doing that? And Natalija, for you, how do you go about perhaps having to do knowledge translation or being able to speak multiple vocabularies between different groups? Maybe you can both share some insights from that perspective, which will give us some texture around how to recreate some of these alliances that we're describing.
Well, you're very much speaking to Donella Meadows' leverage points there. And to really like the first one in terms of transcending paradigms and shifting the values that we use and how we relate to water. I very much agree with what Susan was saying, Zad, about bringing food as like the center. And so one of the things that I've been doing is trying to revitalize this very grassroots connection to the water, and not just in terms of the litter cleanups and the conservation work, and Toronto Nature Stewards and groups like that are amazing and I love them. And the TRCA does really good work, but they're being handcuffed and their funding's also being cut, unfortunately. And what I'm trying to do is kind of step into those gaps by connecting people to each other, to have the dialogues, to have that shared understanding, and to facilitate, well, what are we seeing in our community? What is our relationship to this creek? How do we see that manifest on our property? But also, what is our emotional connection to it? Like, how is our well-being tied to it? Getting people to reflect on those times where they may have been sad or wanted to walk by the water and what that did for them, and building upon that emotional connection while also connecting people to each other, and also doing that knowledge transfer of collectively sharing what is their understanding of the watershed and needs, what changes have they noticed, what impact resulted from those changes. Then you can build a base that can start advocating for the implementation of watershed plans. And then there's more of that watershed literacy. But if you don't have communities building their identity around the watershed and understanding what that is and how it impacts them, then they're not thinking in terms of systems, and they're not advocating for our decision makers to be thinking in terms of systems. And what I would love to see is if we were to take watersheds as a basis of citizen assemblies and then start institutionalizing dialogue at that scale. So that's, yeah, a bit of how I've been trying to do that work right now, in addition to the rain grid stuff. Susan?
I love that. Honestly, I love that. And I felt like that was what the Humber Watershed Alliance was. It was that, exactly. And it wasn't just citizens. It was politicians that were with us. It was different people together. And it was a citizens alliance on a watershed scale. That's what that was. And it worked very well. We got the Humber designated a Canadian Heritage River in 1999 through that alliance. We won the National Heritage Trust Award through that alliance. We did good things. But, you know, it really boils down to a few passionate people. Much like this forum, you know, we really have the power to change the world. But it's, you know, it's almost like that light and, you know, in the distance. And you have to find a way to work towards it. And I guess for me, like, getting people outdoors is always best, because I feel like no matter where you're from in the world, you have a relationship to water. Everybody does. And if your river that's near you, if you ever have the chance to get near it, is clean and flowing well and accessible and healthy, you're happy when you see it. And if it's the opposite, you're not happy when you see it. And I feel like there is a direct relationship there. And so I remember, it's funny, Zaid, like how you describe how you communicate it, because I remember when I left the planning department at the TRCA and I went into watershed management. And I got on a tour bus with a whole bunch of the Citizen Alliance for the Humber Watershed. And it was my turn to talk about the Humber. And I immediately had this planner hat on where I started talking about watershed management and the concerns of the Humber and all these different things. And I could tell immediately I had lost the crowd and I had worried them. Desperately, I'd worried them. I could tell my boss at the time was like, what are you doing? But it was my planner language. And I feel like I still am encumbered by it sometimes because you're kind of trying to understand the nuances of the policy interpretations and what it actually means in terms of how things get approved, and then like how it intersects with other laws. And it's a layered landscape, right? And so when you're trying to explain that to people, like citizens groups or organizations that are trying to, that have that ethic of care naturally for the water or for the bioregional system, and they love it and they want to do something good for it, it can be really hard to kind of explain to them what's happening in and around them, without losing them in a way, or without really worrying them. And so I have to tell you, I haven't figured that out yet. I'm still working on doing that, but at the end of the day, getting people by the river is always the best thing. So, those classic moments of like just being outside and planting trees and picking up the garbage and having an expert come and talk by the river about the fish that rely on this watershed. And that to me is always the best connector. And I do that in my own neighborhood. I do that all the time here. I'm always trying to bring people out. We're trying to pay attention to the Silver Creek, which is the branch of the West Credit, because it runs right through town.
Yeah.
But that's how at least I find myself trying to bridge that gap where I'm not a policy wonk, but there's times where I sound like one, and it just doesn't connect with people.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I need Natalija.
It sounds like between both of your responses, there's a shared familiarity for bringing to surface the relationships that people have to water as the fundamental means. And so you're kind of dissolving the artificial knowledge boundaries that people may captivate themselves within, and breaking through that by just going back to relating to the subject at hand, i.e. putting yourself in the environment or the system itself. So there's a lot of insight into that. So I think there's merit to that.
Yeah,
Any
bringing
other?
more parts, like a more awareness that each of the part has, that they're part of that whole in the watershed. They have a right to speak to it.
Yeah, and I
Absolutely.
love how Stephen said, like, to see the system within you, or even how you say, Natalia, how the system, moments that the system sees itself. But I love that idea of like seeing the watershed within us, and it kind of makes me think of that classic image of that Aboriginal image of the woman who it's not for No More Stolen Sisters, but it's for the water walkers. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? The water walker image and how the cloud has rain coming to it and the rain comes through her. And it's like, seeing the system within us. Yeah, that's the one. Thank you. Water's life. So you can see right there. And it's funny because Peter's partner helped me in an engagement process. Actually, I don't think Patricia was involved with this one, Peter. But there was, I engaged the water walkers with the International Joint Commission a couple of years ago. And the water walker, one water walker said to the IJC, water is not a resource, it's a life source. And it was like, right, it's so simple, but it's so clear. And I just think, I think back to like, here I go as a police wonk again, but it's the bioregional system that touches and concerns our lives the most directly, right? Like you can think about the ocean, you can think about the boreal forest, you can think about the ring of fire, you can think about the tundra, you can imagine the great desert plains, or you can imagine the Amazon, but your river in your neighborhood is your equivalent. it's the bioregional system that filters your air that you breathe when you walk outside in the morning, that is taking your stormwater and sending it through to the ocean. It's, you know, it's where all the birds that are pollinating or the insects that are pollinating hatch and grow. It's what touches you and your life force the most directly, your watershed.
Stephen Sillett, you had your hand up for a second. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just curious about how big a challenge the boundary between the US and Canada is, and I'm wondering whether, I believe Lake Michigan's the only lake that's like it's all within the US, and whether they find it easier to have that sense of that being part of the watershed for all of the areas around it because it's all in the one country. Because it is kind of strange, because you try and imagine the water going into Lake Ontario, but because it's not an ocean, it doesn't feel the same as like going to the seaside or something. And because the other side of the lake is another, you know, it's a completely different country. I'm wondering how that plays out, if at all. Just a question or a curiosity if that's something you encountered. Like, has Lake Michigan got a lot of good stuff going on because of that, or maybe it's just my musing?
And I'd say that the Great Lakes as a region are really quite cohesive and have done a really great job to plan collectively, like even from environmental angle perspective, funders had the wisdom to connect us on both sides of the border to exchange on strategies for how do we work to remediate Lake Erie and tackle the nutrient pollution issue. And then there's also the IJC from the Boundary Waters Treaty, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. There's the Great Lakes Compact that the premiers are also a part of in terms of more of an observing status. And there's a lot of agreements and coordination mechanisms that might not have like meant that Canada and the US signed on to some of the more European models or global models for setting international laws and standards, but it's because there's been a long history of cooperation between Canada and the US. Unfortunately, we haven't really found a way to bring in Indigenous governments yet, and it's been very bilateral. But it's through that exchange of science and continuous coordination that, yeah, I'd say a lot of folks around the Great Lakes do connect to that shared identity and economy as a whole. I don't know if that answers your question though, or if you think that.
It's just more of a curiosity. I was just putting it out there to see whether, in terms of, I mean, at a macro level, I get that, but I'm thinking more at a lived experience level for people to feel that a connection, because I kind of feel like the watersheds, it's like from the lake out, whereas if you've got the lake, if the lakes within, say, Canada, you can imagine that the whole of the area around it feels like you're in that same watershed, but sometimes it can feel a little bit separated here, do you know, because we're on, it's like what happens in Ontario, you know, as opposed to what happens in Rochester or down there. I mean, I'm just curious whether Michigan's had any better results because of that side of things, because it's all within the US, but maybe not.
Well, the US Army Corps of Engineers has done a really good job. Like, they're investing quite a bit actually in the Great Lakes. And so the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 has a dividing line that goes from, you know, the east to west coast all the way across the country. And it follows the boundary of the United States, but it looks specifically at how binationally Canada and the US will work together. You're right, like Lake Michigan is almost entirely in the States, right? And it's connected hydrologically to Lake Huron through the Straits of Mackinac. So technically it's one lake. It just looks like a pair of lungs, but they're hydrologically connected through the straits. And so, you know, Michigan is not Ontario, you know, it's really very different. And I think that there are concerns in Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is large, and so is Lake Huron. They are large. The Great Lakes are big. And, They're called the inland sea for a reason because they're big bodies of water. Like you don't get a sense of the boundary of the lake. It takes a long time even to drive from like Niagara Falls, where Lake Ontario starts. Really, Niagara on the Lake is where Lake Ontario starts. All the way to the St. Lawrence River, just on the Canadian side, that's hours of driving. And so that's just Lake Ontario, and Lake Ontario is the smallest. So if you think about like the size of these things, they're huge. Lake Superior is huge. And so it's hard to get a sense of the community of these bodies of water because they're just big enough to almost not necessarily have a connected community. But what's happening on the north side and the south side, like Michigan side, because that's entirely in the States, is really very different. We're having different practices, but I think truthfully, there's more investment on the south side of the border. There has been recently, and they're decommissioning a whole bunch of dams, and they're doing a lot of good work. And the IJC is really emphasizing Indigenous governance as part of this process. They are really trying. The problem is there's been a systemic neglect, Indian Act by design. And there's a lot of investment required to support First Nations and tribal nations to be able to have the capacity, human resources to come to the table. But I think once we start supporting Aboriginal governance, as was always intended within the treaties of Canada, the better we will all be, because it's a very different way of looking at relationship to land. And I like to think, a lot of us are from somewhere else, right? And I sometimes imagine like if that we weren't, maybe we would care a little more, about where we live. Like if this is where we always all came from, if we were all Indigenous, maybe we would care just as much as they do. And so there's that deep relationship to land. The ancestral relationship is powerful. And I think the sooner we can support its expression, the better we will all be. Yeah, I don't know if I have any more to say there.
Yeah, I mean, like right now we have new drinking water legislation that's coming through, and the more that recognizes inherent Indigenous rights, the quicker we're actually going to address the boil water advisories, because if they have a say in how the watersheds are being affected, I mean, I began this conversation by talking about the fact that I remember being able to drink water directly from the streams in Bosnia. Most people would be terrified if they were to think of going to Black Creek and trying to drink water where it's channelized, heated, and there's no life in there. Water naturally can be that clean, and nature, there's ecosystem services that we've just been inhibiting. And so going back to some natural laws and values and finding ways to bring them into this Western governance model, I think is very much necessary. But in terms of what else has been happening, I think Waukesha might be something that would be of interest to you as an example of how identity is formed around the Great Lakes or not.
Sorry, go ahead, Susan, if you're going to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm really glad, Natalija, that you mentioned the Canadian Water Agency, because that's also something that is super important. And there was a huge announcement recently, $500 million announced for investment in the Great Lakes. That was last year, right? Just last year in November or October. So there's, I think there's a counter tide. So with all the things that I've shared, all the concerns we have as it relates to Ontario, I think there is a counter tide of support out there. And the Great Lakes, I think, will be a point of a lot of emphasis. At least I hope and believe that it should be. And I think that the Canada Water Agency, while it will be based in Winnipeg, there's going to be a lot of, there'll probably be a lot of eyes on the Great Lakes system. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Natalija for mentioning the Canadian Water Agency.
Awesome. We're almost at 8 o'clock. So if there's any other comments or questions, feel free to keep them. We can go for another 15 minutes or so. But one, I don't have a question, more just a reflection based on what you've both been speaking about. It seems to me like there's this underlying aspect of redirecting people's attention to the fundamental importance of water in a way that they currently don't have in their everyday life, but also to do with like the localism aspect of it and trying to get people to consider a more local imprint of their living. And I'm just reflecting on if I was to position this in I hate to break out like lame strategy frameworks, like what is your competition? I think your competition is all the what's it called? The alienation of infrastructure to its source. And so I think when so many people have a distant relationship to these services and to these life forces such as water, and so the challenge often becomes how can we redirect people's attention to water, and when is that most appropriate? And that's just a reflection I wanted to share.
It's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like Susan, you already spoke to it quite a bit in terms of when is the most appropriate. The litter cleanups and the educational experiences when they're already there, but it's hard to bring them there. So how can we do that in more creative ways? How can we start using art and theater and music? Like, I really love that the Swedes have plogging, right? Like getting really creative about drawing people out and playing off of what their tastes are instead of pushing the wonky perspective onto the public, seeing, okay, what are people talking about and how can we link that to their concerns and the broader conversation on water. And you're fully right. Like I am talking a lot about narratives and shifting narratives. And for me, it comes from that peace space because that was a motivator for entering into watershed management. And Lao Tzu has this whole beautiful saying about if there's to be peace between countries, there must be peace between cities. And if there's to be peace between cities, there must be peace between neighbors. If there's to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in the family. And if there's to be peace in the family, there must be peace in the heart. So again, like there's that idea of subsidiarity and integrity within that fractal. And to talk at like the highest level of, whoa, what we're doing nationally without doing it in our backyard just doesn't really make very much sense.
Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to share any comments or reflection that wants to maybe share any thoughts or has anything? I know, Kelly, you had a question a little while back that I didn't get a chance to go to, and I can even scroll up because I recall Kelly, I can maybe speak on her behalf if she's stepped away, but she was talking about comment on pharmaceuticals and toxins coming into the water system.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that was Susan, at a certain point you were chatting about some of the pollutants that were filling up, especially I'm not sure if this question was, oh, right, citizen pharmaceuticals. That's what she's referring to.
It's
Yeah,
a big
not
problem.
corporate.
It is a big problem. Yeah. Yeah, I know that's been identified, Kelly. Like, and you know, what do we do, right? Like, that's a big concern. And I think it's talked about in some of the research that's been done for the annexes on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. I know that I've seen some research on that, and I'm not sure what the recommended outcomes are. But you know, that's a problem. That's for sure. Maybe it's, you know, treating, improving the infrastructure for sewer systems, like sewage treatment, you know, kind of before it goes into the lake. Perhaps there's something there. But it's that, I know that's an issue that's being researched actively.
And it's also banning the production of certain chemicals in
Right.
consumer products as well. So going upstream a little bit. And Environmental Defense has some really good campaigns on that, as does Canadian Environmental Law Association. And sorry for being a little bit Canada-centric, because I know there's folks that are from everywhere.
Yeah, no, I love the Canadian Environmental Law Association. I just want to, and Environmental Defense too. I just want to share the love. I want to share also 2 examples from my experience working with First Nations. So one thing that we do when we have a meeting is we bring water into the room. And so this came from Treaty 3, Grand Council Treaty 3, Northern Ontario. And what Carolyn King and I had done this before, again with Peter Jones's partner Patricia Kimbich, but we brought water into the room, and so we introduce water before we talk about water, and so it's, you know, creating a sense of presence with it. And Carolyn got the idea from the Anishinaabe up north in Treaty 3 area, where they had a discussion with a logging company, and they brought in a basket full of like bark and trees and earth, and they put it in the middle of the table. Or sometimes they would bring a chair to the table and they would say, this is where water sits, or this is where the forest sits. The forest takes this chair, before they would enter into negotiations with logging companies. So its symbolism is powerful. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say, I'm the strategic coordinator of the Moccasin Identifier, which is an education and awareness program on treaties and understanding treaties. And it came from Carolyn King, who has the Order of Canada. And this is her baby. And it's really about trying to help all non-Indigenous people understand our relationship to land and each other through treaties. And it's so simple. It's in the school program. And it's a stenciling activity where people stencil on the ground the moccasin to remind themselves of Indigenous relationship to land. And the moccasins wash away, and it comes at the end of it like an educational program. So where they learn about treaties in the treaty area that they're in, and then at the end they ground their knowledge by stenciling moccasins on the ground. And it's focused on children, but we also do it with adults. And the whole idea is like, we're starting over with the children for reconciliation. And so maybe that's another idea for watershed management, like trying to find that the stencil of the moccasin is a super simple, powerful image. And maybe there's a way, like Yellowfish Road or the Yellowfish program was when conservation authorities led successfully for a long time, where they would paint fish by the storm grates, so children would remember where their water goes. And I sometimes think it's, simple messages like that are just the most powerful reminders, and help us want to do better.
So it looks like David Hawk has David Hawk.
If I might clearly confuse things a little bit, perhaps we're, working a little bit too much on the side of analysis and not really synthesis, and that was we're talking about. But at least based on my approach to the world and things I do, I am a little fearful of separating water out as a distinct commodity. I tend to look at air, water, and land as a triumvirate, and the problems in each tend to go to the other. And early on, the regulation, late 60s, early 70s, at least in the US, had to do with concentrating on each of the three domains. And of course, then the pollution went to the other two, obviously. And so it became even more of a problem than when they started. And so how to overcome that became a major problem of the 70s and the 80s, which I don't think they overcame. But they found things got even worse by doing that. If you'd like to go sort of off on another track, but it is the same track, is to go back to the issue of the tragedy of the commons and how that relates to the water mass you're talking about. And probably my best advice is not to go read the article, which has its ups and downs. It comes a little bit too much out of MIT for my like, so I tend to not use it, but at least it's a base point. And I would recommend you go to Wikipedia and look up Tragedy of the Commons and see the many, many pages that they outline of trying to get to, in essence, what we're talking about in terms of this water and who pollutes it, who doesn't, what pollutes it, what is the essence of the problem. And the way that Wikipedia deals with it is quite interesting, particularly in terms of taking it to a fourth area of the commons called internet or digital commons. And so then you have four to talk about, and are there any solutions in one that are worth taking back to the other three? And because Wikipedia is obviously from the digital world, they have an interest in what's happening digitally in terms of the mess that's being made that's much like the mess everywhere else. And so I would recommend you take a peek at least at Wikipedia and Tragedy of the Commons and how not far we've come. We have not resolved the tragedy of the commons. And I would be a little bit careful of depending on a regulation to ultimately save us. I think I can show pretty clearly that that has not worked very well anywhere, in any country, in any piece. And I think a number of you talked about somehow getting people into more of the significant base value change is much more needed, much more effective, and that's where it's at. And so if you can come up with a story that effectively combines air, water, land, and what those three together mean, well, if nothing else, you can scare hell out of people by waking up in August and saying, let's talk about Mexico City and how is it doing today? Is there any water in Mexico City at all? Et cetera, et cetera. And then you've captured a great deal of attention. Don't worry, it's coming. Don't worry, you'll have examples that will really excite the people you're discussing things with. And be careful of them segmenting, say, yeah, that's Mexico, though. This is Canada. We're all different up here. It's not an issue. But I think you have examples cropping up that are going to be very effective at capturing attention. I worry most about what you do once you capture that attention. And be careful of analysis. Be careful of segmentation. So far, that has not worked. In my research areas, that always became part of the problem. Sorry, does that confuse?
No,
I had the tragedy of commons in my notes, actually.
Yeah.
I wanted to speak to that legal principle. I love that one.
Eleanor Ostrom countered to it, and part of the solutions that she comes up with of how to collectively cover and have those community-based norms is to make sure they're also being incentivized and that there's someone that's responsible for enforcing them. And we very much talked about that with the TRCA and where regulations are going. But I think in terms of flipping things on their head again, yes, we talked about integrated water resource management that does do that bridge between land and water, maybe not air as much, but scientists do take into account the temperature, say with what that does for Lake Erie algal blooms and the mixing that happens that makes eutrophication such a problem. But if we were to ask a question that David Ng began with before some of you joined, and that was, how do we reorient our system to not seeing it as these different parts that we're weaving together in a Western model, but instead, what does the system need from us? What does water need from us? What does the watershed need from us? And say with something as challenging as groundwater, where it's much harder to measure, if we were to just operate all of these parts in the system with that kind of question in our background, how might we be acting differently? How might we be just voluntarily starting to recharge the aquifer?
That's really cool. I like that a lot.
We're winding down soon, so Dawn and then Anna, maybe in yeah, if you can keep your questions. Well, we have some time, but yeah, we're winding down, so we'll go to Dawn first and then Anna after.
Oh, okay, well, I'll be quick because I heard a couple of things that's resonated with me. I was listening to Astra Taylor's talks in the Massey lectures from last year, and she talked about this being the age of insecurity. And one of the things she mentioned was way back at the signing of Magna Carta, there was another treaty signed, which was how did it go? She said this was the right of the forest. The people would have the right to continue to go out and forage, that the land basically, with some exceptions, of course, still belonged to everybody. And this relates to the comment about the commons, and of course what followed, which was the closure of all the fields and all the forests as they became property as opposed to common good. Now, I believe, and this is reflected in those lectures, that something happened in the minds certainly of the people in England, but I think it certainly happened across Europe as well, which has now become the official Western approach, that we do not have that right to land and everything that goes with it. We only have the right to compete. We only have freedom politically and economically. That's it. It stops right there. So we don't have that association. We don't have that, except in traditional pockets, not only in North America, but across the world, where they still have that direct notion that the land and everything that goes with it, the water, obviously, the air, as David was saying, it's all there. It's really a common heritage. But we've put that out of our minds because we're in a different system, we're on a different track, and we have been for hundreds of years. It's going to be very tough to turn that around. And that's what I'd like to say.
Wow, that was really cool. I'm going to listen to the Massey lectures. I have to say, I have to go, everyone. I'm so sorry. That's my son, and I have to take him to a swimming lesson.
That's very water appropriate. So if it was anything else, we'd say no thanks. But if it's swimming lessons, that's totally permissible. No, I'm joking. It's all good, Susan. Thank you so much. Yeah, really appreciate you being here. Thank you.
I really enjoyed myself, everybody. I wish you all such a great evening, and thank you so much for such rich food for thought. Take care, everyone.
Take care. We still have maybe just another few minutes, or just with Natalija. If I don't know if you want to respond to it. It sounds like Don just wanted to share a reflection. Natalija, if you would like to respond, you can. Otherwise, we can go to Anna and then close.
I think David had a really great response to Don's comment in terms of every man's rights in Finland as a counter. And I'm very good with it being a collective space and everyone sharing.
Anna, did you want to share your reflection?
Oh, yes. I actually, since we were talking about narratives and, how can we convey this, the nature of connectedness of water resources, I wanted to share like a little thing I Googled in preparation for this meeting. So if everyone remembers Aesop, the, Greek fables, he was enslaved to a philosopher named Xanthus, and there's the famous anecdote that Xanthus was drunk one day at a banquet, and he boasted that he can drink the sea. And so the next day, his friends took him to the seaside and said, "Okay, well, go ahead, drink the sea." And he begged Aesop to get him out of the situation. So Aesop said, "Okay, tell them that, all right, I'll drink the sea, but first you gotta separate the water from all the rivers and all the lakes that flows into the sea, and then I'll drink what's left of it." So yeah, I remember it from my childhood. So whatever water we drink or whatever water we use for anything, it's basically we're drinking and using water from all over the world. And it's impossible to separate our water from their water because it flows all around. So yeah, that was something that I wanted to share. And that's it.
Water knows no boundaries. It's a beautiful metaphor. Thank you.
So yeah, I think maybe as the final comment, Natalija, I just wanted to maybe let you wrap with the prompt of the title of the session. What can systems thinkers learn from watershed stewardship? If you want to leave us with some parting words.
Think about what the living system needs and you will do well.
Nice. Okay, short and pointed. I like it. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for joining this session. That was Systems Thinking Ontario number 120. What can Systems Think and Learn from Watershed Stewardship? We'll be on next month again on Monday, May 12th. The session in planning, the topic is still underway, so we'll keep you all posted. And then after that, in the summer months, we're hoping to get together with some of the students from OCAD University on their synthesis map. So we're going to change the setup a little bit. So that should be exciting and something to look forward to. So thank you all again. Thank you, Natalija. Thank you, Susan. Really appreciate you being here. I know Susan had to run early, but it's been a wonderful discussion and we're really grateful for it.
Thanks so much for coordinating that and everyone for being here.
Have a great evening,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks, all.
Great discussion. Thank you, Zach.